that link between geopolitics and trade and operations on the ground, it's probably never been closer. Which brings me back to you, Mr. Shearing. So, your book, The Fractured Age, argues we're not seeing deglobalization, we're seeing fracturing into competing trade blocs led by the US and China. Walk us through the key evidence, and has anything since publication, well, and not least the US stick waving in early 26 against its own allies as we're talking now in the third week of January, has any of these things made you reconsider your thesis?
Yeah, good question. So the genesis of the book, the Fractured Age, kind of goes all the way back to President Trump's first term in office. Back then, we had the start of trade wars, tariffs going up, frictions in the global system, lots of headlines in the financial press and the FT and the Wall Street Journal about countries turning inwards, the world deglobalizing, returning to the 1930s. And you saw this rhetoric everywhere, but you couldn't really see it in the data. Indeed, when we looked at world trade flows as a share of global GDP, still close to record highs, global capital flows, it's not just about trade, global capital flows off their 2007 highs, but still extremely high by historic standards. And despite the repeated efforts of Western governments to push back against immigration, global migration flows, people flows, labour flows were still extremely high by historic standards too. So we kind of asked ourselves at Capital Economics, well, what has changed? Because something clearly has changed. And the view that we came to when we looked at the data was that the central driving force in the global economy was not a turning inwards, it was not deglobalizing. Rather, it was a fracturing, splintering of the global economy into two blocks. One essentially centered on the US and another centered on China. And then that was forcing these two economies to pull apart and increasingly forcing countries to take a side. So if you think about, to give a real life example of this in action, where the US gets its cell phones from now, one clock back 5 years, China was the dominant supplier of cell phones to the US market, supplying about 60% of the US cell phones. Today, China supplies barely 1 in 5 cell phones to the US market, and having supplied almost nothing 5 years ago, Vietnam and India are the two largest suppliers of cell phones to the US market. So a real life example there of how supply chains have been configured around these geopolitical blocks. Big questions. First of all is, can this fracturing between the two blocks be contained to just geopolitically sensitive sectors, things that involve high tech, dual purpose goods, semiconductors, biotech, smartphones, given the amount of data in them, for example? Or is it a more pervasive split? How do different countries organize themselves? Who do they align with? Do they align with China? Do they align with the US? Before the Trump administration, about 60% of the world's GDP was in the US bloc and only 20% was in the China bloc, and a few countries were neutral. From our reading of the situation, some of the administration's policies have shifted some economies a bit further out of the US bloc and towards a more neutral category, neutral camp. So the question is, does that continue? So these are the questions that I'm thinking about now. I don't think it necessarily tears up the thesis. I think it actually supports the thesis. If you look at tariff rates on different countries, they're much higher on China from the US. They're much higher on China than they are, say, on Europe at this stage.
At this stage, being the key.
This stage.
Yeah. So what? But how did events over in Greenland at the moment and this potential conflict between Europe and the US? How does that push Europe a little bit further away from the US bloc? Is it way too early to talk about that?
Well, I think it's probably too early to say, right? I think it remains to be seen how this plays out. I think what we've learned from European leaders over the past 12 months is that they're going to take a pretty pragmatic attitude and stance on these kind of issues. They're open to negotiation. I don't think that includes over the sovereignty of Greenland, by the way. I think that is a red line. But there are various mechanisms and deals that could be done that could eventually be presented by the US as a victory. So it remains to be seen exactly how this plays out. But it certainly has the potential to drive a wedge through the transatlantic alliance. And if there was any attempt by the US to take Greenland by force, then yes, I think that would be a fundamental fracturing of that US bloc. Wouldn't necessarily mean that the US and China became closer together, but maybe you get a third bloc analogy in this fractured world.
The US has more economic firepower overall, that US-led bloc at least. But there's a lot of China has advantages in some areas that to technology and some critical minerals, and we've seen them leveraging this power in the negotiations. Do other countries need to build alternative supply chains for things like rare earths, or is that harder than, say, Washington thinks? And maybe Washington can build those supply chains, but can other countries like Europe, for example, or other blocs like Europe, can they build those alternative supply chains? Are they going to have to rely on Washington, or I don't know, what's their alternative?
Well, there's certainly a school of thought that would argue that if in this fractured world, Europe should forge its own path, should become a third bloc in this increasingly splintered world. I frankly have a hard time believing that Europe can do that, is capable of doing it. Not because it lacks the economic heft. If you put all the European economies together, then as a share of global GDP, they're similar in size to the US and actually larger than China. But they're a collection of sovereign states. They struggle to speak with one voice. They move slowly. They govern by consensus. All laudable qualities, but they don't necessarily make a global economic superpower. And they lack the technological capabilities that both the US and increasingly China has. So I'm a bit skeptical that Europe can necessarily develop, particularly in areas of high tech, supply chains that are independent of both China and the US if they wanted to do so for national security grounds, which means that they'll be inevitably forced, I think, to pick a side. At the moment, they will align more naturally with the US. I think that continues to be the case. This is only one, it's one administration. We'll wait to see what happens in 2028. The ties, the economic, social, historical, financial ties between the US and Europe remain extremely deep, and it will take a lot to break those up. But they're being put under enormous strain, that's for sure.
In this new world where supply chains are almost geopolitical weapons, we've got export controls, tariffs, government dictated procurement, closed market, all these rapid rule changes, and almost the end of UN institutions that often have been enabled the resolution of trade conflicts. For multinationals caught in the middle, how do you plan when your supply chain could become a foreign policy target overnight, when there's no longer this, the UN or a global referee?
Indeed, I mean, every single multilateral institution, whether it's the UN, whether it's the WTO, whether it's the IMF, the World Bank, they're all under pressure in this fractured world, and they perhaps lack some of the clarity they once had. If you're a multinational, I think one of the lessons of the past several years has been that it's much better to move of your own volition and slowly and gradually than it is to be forced to do so rapidly. Now, if you think about how European supply chains around energy shifted, that was clearly not because of US-China fracturing, but it was a different example. It was Russian aggression in Ukraine. But they were forced to change and adapt very quickly, and that imposed enormous costs through the supply chain. In contrast, I write about it in the book, there's a case study in Toyota after the Fukushima nuclear power plant disaster. They reorientated their supply chains to remove single points of failure within them and did it over several years. And conclusion was they imposed almost zero cost to those supply chains. So if you're a multinational firm, the first job to do is to identify whether you think you're operating in a sector that's potentially a bit more geopolitically sensitive and therefore vulnerable to some of these forces, subject to some of these forces, and then to act. Don't try and wish it away. Don't try and wish the world back to kind of pre-fracturing, globalized, multilateral, rules-based order. To accept the world as you see it and to act. Because if you move slowly and you move gradually and you, in anticipation of events, the cost that you impose in your supply chains is a lot smaller than if you're forced to by events.